Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'amotov b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So I think that it's pretty safe to say that we hear a lot the notion that in Jewish space you can ask more or less whatever question you want. That actually Judaism encourages asking a question. That it's a culture and a religious tradition of doubting everything, arguing about everything, and questioning everything. The ethics of our ancestors even going to the length of saying that a shy person cannot learn, and someone who is too strict and doesn't allow questions cannot teach. So we have that notion or that myth or that narrative that in Judaism you can ask whatever question you might. And the truth is that I hear a lot from people that are very proud of that. And I hear even more from people who decide to become Jewish, that one of the reasons that they want to be Jewish or that they fell in love with Jewish culture is that issue that you can ask whatever question you want, and that they came from a faith tradition that did not allow that, mainly from people who were Catholic, but not only Catholic, that they could not ask questions. So what we're going to do in the 55 minutes that we have together is actually examine that idea through traditional texts, all of them from our rabbinical literature, and see, is it true that Judaism is actually 100% pro-questions? Is it true that in a Jewish space you can ask whatever question you want? And first and foremost, I actually want to ask the people here, the three people here and the people that are on the screen. I haven't counted how many people are in the screen. Have you ever been personally in a Jewish space? Or have you ever heard from your child that a question was raised and it was shushed, it was shunned, that the teacher, the rabbi, the lecturer, the person in charge found that question to be inappropriate and shun it away? Have you ever had that experience?
I can't say I have.
So I have that experience, and I'll let people share afterwards, but I had it a lot of times. I'll give you one example from here, from Louisville, in our joint venture of all the congregations in the Hebrew high school that we have for all the students. We had two guests from Israel, two Israeli teachers from our partnership together region. And one of the students asked them about working with the Arab population in the Western Galilee. Now, I don't know if you know that, we have a partnership region. The federation is part of 9 federations that has a partnership region in Israel. And it's the Western Galilee, and it's an area in Israel that actually Jews are not a majority there. The Arab population there is a majority. So one of the teachers started answering, and a rabbi who was there, I'm not going to say the name because we're on Yom Kippur and I don't want to add to the long list that I have of sins that I need to repent for already. One of the rabbis there shushed both the teacher, the guest from Israel, and the student, and said that in this space, we're only saying good things about Israel. We're not talking about the problems in Israel. And I was shocked. I actually shared with him after that, not in front of the students, my shock for two reasons. One, I happen to think that it's a good thing that not only Jews live in Israel, so I didn't see it as a bad or a negative spell on Israel that are Israeli citizens that are not Jewish. And two, I was shocked by the fact that the question was shushed. But that was not the only time, by the way. I'm quite surprised that no one here remembers any time that they were shushed, or that maybe I'm so intimidating that you don't want to share such a point. Maybe I shushed you and you don't want to embarrass me in public on Yom Kippur. But if anybody wants to share, and if not, we'll go to the text. Anyone? Nothing. Okay, that's fine. So we will look at one or two texts. If we're really lucky, it's 3 texts. I actually prepared 5 texts for here from rabbinical literature on issues, on times, on moments where the Jewish space becomes not pro questions. When people are shushed, when they're or shunned even, or rebuked when they ask a question. And we'll look at how is that relevant for today. What's the lesson there? Okay, I'm using the fact that Johanna is here. What's the lesson? She always tells me that I should say, what's the lesson that we learned from that text? And I want us to ask ourselves, why, when we read the question, the story about a question, why is that question not okay? Okay, what's the reason? That's the main thing that we're going to ask. What made that question not okay so much that the rabbis in this case, in each case, it's the rabbis in the text that I brought, are going to say, this is not part of our discourse. What's the dynamics there? And how is the community reacting to that when this is happening? What makes a question in a Jewish space a dangerous question? And the fascinating thing to me, I'll admit something before we go into the text. The fascinating thing to me is this all comes from classical rabbinical scriptures. And by the way, I didn't have to look hard to find such stories. There are a lot of stories in our tradition of questions that were shushed, on people that were pushed out because they asked the wrong, quote unquote, a question. But the fascinating thing to me, the rabbis, you would think, are all about questions. We learn that the culture of the rabbis is a culture of arguing, of controversy, of raising questions to each other, of challenging one another. So when does a question become illegitimate? So we'll start with a very famous text. It's actually comes from I brought it from the original Midrash, but it will sound very familiar for you because we actually read this text every year when we try to pass on our tradition to the next generation, to make them question seekers. So it's quite a fascinating text to be in the center of this a night of passing our tradition, our love to our tradition, to our history, to the people of Israel, to the next generation. So here it's from the Mechilta, but I think you will all find this text very familiar. Mechilta is a very old midrash on the book of Genesis. It's from the land of Israel. And there are 4 questions there. I only brought 2. The one of the wise kid and the evil kid. I think that you already know where is that familiar to you. It's also in the Passover Agadah. And I'll just say one thing. You know, the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem put a wonderful Agadah. I don't get percentage from promoting it, but it is a wonderful Agadah. It's called The Night of Questions. we think that Passover is the night of questions, right? That's where we encourage our kids to ask questions. And by the way, Maimonides and Rabbi Eliezer are saying that you actually don't need the Haggadah. You just need to do crazy stuff and get the kids to ask a question, and then you don't need Manishtana. Then they'll ask questions because they'll be curious. So Maimonides is saying, set the table, and then when people sit to eat, just start collecting the dishes. So everybody will say to you, what's going on here? And then you will answer. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying, give the children matzahs and then snap it away from them. So then they will ask questions. So it's all about asking questions in the Haggadah. And here, something that is quoted in the Haggadah from the Mechilta, probably from the 2nd century CE in the land of Israel. So let's read it and ask ourselves, what's the problem with the question here? Why is that going to be shunned away? And as you know, we have 4 typical children that ask questions. One that doesn't know how to ask, so it's actually only 3 of them ask because there's one who doesn't know how to ask. We have the simple child, the evil child, and the wise child. I brought the wise and the evil. Kate, would you volunteer to read?
Sure.
We can't hear you really, Kate.
Oh.
I cannot hear you. I don't know about other people.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. What does the wise child say? What are the testimonies, the laws, and statutes that the Lord our God commanded you? Deuteronomy 6:20. Thus you begin teaching him the laws of Pesach. We do not conclude after the Pesach with an afikoman. Mishnah Pesachim 10:8. What does the wicked child say? What is the service to you? Exodus 12:26. To you and not to him. And because he takes himself outside the collective and denies the central principle, thus you blunt his teeth and say to him, on account of this God wrought for me when I went out of Egypt, for me and not for you. If you had been there, you would not have been saved.
Okay, so sounds familiar, right? We say it to our children, to our grandchildren every year when we try to pass our wonderful tradition to them. A tradition, as you guys testified, we allow every question possible and we tell them this story. So let's start with the perfect child, the wise child. That's the good child that everybody loves. He is asking a question about the ritual, about the laws and the statutes, and we answer with a very detailed answer. It seems like a little answer, but it's actually not a little answer at all. We say to him, we don't do the afikoman after the Pesach. Now, the Pesach is done only at the temple. So this is the year 200, this is the 2nd century, this is more or less 100 years after the temple is destroyed. So actually what the rabbis are saying, with such a wonderful kid, such a wise, good kid, you should give them a real detailed answer. You can give them the history of the laws and statutes that create the holiday of Passover. And you start with that, but you're going to give him like an hour of history, detailed, because this is such a great question that you can give that. And then what happens? The evil child asks a question. Now, I'm going to ask you that, okay? What's the problem with the question? Kate, can you read again just the evil, the part about the evil guy?
What does the wicked child say? What is the service to you and not to him? And because he takes himself outside the collective and denies the central principle, thus you blunt his teeth and say to him, on account of this God wrought for me when I went out of Egypt, for me and not for you. If you had been there, you would not have been saved.
Okay. So I just want to say one thing before you guys, someone is going to answer what's the problem there. His answer is a very short one. His entire answer is, what is this service to you? Which is a direct quote from Exodus 12:26. Okay? And okay, I'm not going to go into the context in Exodus. What's the problem with the question? Look at the reaction is, you blunt his teeth. I don't even know what it really means to blunt his teeth. And I have it in the Hebrew, so it's not my English, okay? I don't know what it means to do that. Please, Susan, you have an answer. What's the problem there? Susan Eled, aren't you raising your hand, or is it something that I said? I know it's in the background there. Okay. Benji, help me if someone is raising their hands. I can't really see the screen that well. Anyone, what's the problem with the question? Why this reaction? You blunt his teeth, you tell them, if you were there, you would not be saved. David, please.
Yeah, he's not buying into being part of the process.
Okay, he's not buying into be part of the process. Johanna?
Yeah, that's what I thought, is the child does not include itself.
Okay, he's not including himself in the community.
It's supposedly a masculine child, so I...
Okay. Carol, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, but the first kid, the one we love so, he wasn't including himself either in all these laws and statutes. And it seems to me like the second kid is just giving the response that Maimonides wanted. You know, what is all this weird stuff? Tell me about it. I never thought the wicked kid got a fair shake.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think it's because the wicked kid was rude in what he had to say here.
Okay, so I want to say something about that and then go back to what Carol said. So maybe he was rude. The problem with this text, unlike today, we're recording this. So if one day this will become a classic text, you can say, when Kate read it, she read it in that tone, and that tone meant empathy or abusiveness or not regarding whatever, okay? We can read into the emotions of Kate. I'm sorry that I'm picking on you from your tone. But we don't have the tones here. So I don't know if he was rude or not. What we do know is what Carol just shared with us. The questions are actually very similar. The wise child is saying, what is this ritual that you guys are doing? And I'm sorry, the wise child, I'm mixing the two. The wise child is saying, what are those rules and regulations and statutes that you guys are speaking? And the wicked child is saying, what are the rituals that you guys, what do they mean to you? Okay? Ma avodah zot lachem. What is this ritual for you? Now, I want to say two things about it. One, he quotes from Exodus, and I'm going to be very careful because we have Johanna here, who's an expert on the entire Bible, so I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. What's the context in Exodus? In Exodus, they're saying one day you'll be doing those rituals. They will look so strange that your children are going to ask you, what is this ritual for you? In Exodus, it's a perfectly legitimate question. It's foreseeing the future and saying, one day your children won't understand why you're doing those things and they will ask about it, and then just answer them. The other thing that I wanted to say, this is actually a great question. It's great on all levels, okay? That's the kind of questions that rabbis actually ask. Seriously, more than the question of the wise kid. We love when students ask us, what is the meaning of this ritual? First of all, because to be honest, most kids don't ask those questions, right? Most kids just want the Passover to be over. Okay, and finally we'll get to the presents and to the food. So we love it when they show interest and curiosity and ask. But on another level, to the wise kid, he asked, what are these laws? So you can answer in detail. But he's asking, what is this ritual to you? So you not only can give the evil kid the answer about what is the ritual and the history of the ritual, you can actually answer him also, or her, what does it mean to me? Which is a question that rabbis love, everybody loves, parents love. What does it mean to me to do the ritual of the Seder? We would love, I bet you, okay, I'm going to pick on Susan here, that she's willing to pay money to her grandchildren to ask that question. So if she can actually answer it without being given dirty looks like, why are you wasting? Isn't it enough that we have to read the Haggadah? Now you're telling us, what does it mean for you, all those rituals? That is a perfectly legitimate question, in my opinion, okay? So why, okay, if we agree for 1 minute on the premises that Carol said, okay, if you don't remember, Carol said that she doesn't understand why are we giving the harshness to the evil child, that he's not treated well, if I understood you correctly, Carol. So what makes this question illegitimate? Why are the rabbis reacting in such a way? And you know, I have to tell you, every year when we read it in the Haggadah, okay, and I don't know any Haggadah that censors it, okay, not the Reform Haggadah did not censor this part. I'm thinking to myself, this is not one of the highlights of Judaism, okay? If I would have to write down the 10 best moments of Jewish tradition, this would not be part of that, okay? This is actually a very awkward text to share. And we do it every year as we tell the story of our tradition. Now, what's the issue here? Why is a kid, I mean, seriously, read it. A child is asking a question, and the answer is blunt his teeth and tell him, since you don't want to be part of us, then if you were in Egypt, you wouldn't even be, you're not part of the story. We're excluding you of the story. This is really extremely harsh, and it's a child. So why is it? Okay, anyone? Any brave soul?
I actually have a problem with the entire, just the basis that this is the wicked child. I've always had a problem with that, to label the child wicked to begin with. And as you're pointing out, to me, this is a perfectly good question. Why is he being shunned? Why is he being, the answer is incredibly cruel.
Okay, so yes, Benji?
Les Abramson says he's challenging the premise.
Okay, please, Les.
That's in YouTube.
That the child is challenging the premise.
Yeah.
Okay, but then we go to the problem that actually both the wicked child and the wise child are actually asking pretty much similar questions. One says, what are those laws that God gave you? And the other one is saying, what is this ritual that you're doing? It's actually more or less the same question. So is he really challenging the premise? By the way, our next text, we will get to the next text, is about someone that is challenging the premise. So we'll get to that there. But Les, I don't think that's the issue. I think there is another issue, and I think that we were, okay, I won't say that. I see David, and I saw another hand, Kylie. Kylie, please. Heidi, you're muted.
I think the adult who responds so horribly to the wicked child is overly sensitive, because the wise child this is a general question. It's not, he just wants to know what's going on, but this is a direct question. Why is it so important to you? I want to know your personal, and he's, what? I have to defend myself? You're just a wicked child.
Okay. David?
I think it's just a literary setup where they have a straw man. They already have the answer and they just want to make a question they can give the answer to. I think they're just trying to say if a wise person asks a question, they want to understand and be part of what's happening. And if it's a wicked person, then they're excluding themselves. But I think it's really a premise to set it up to give the answer they already have. So I think you're taking it too literally, maybe.
Okay, Johanna?
Well, it's very peculiar to me because I did check in my Bible, and this is a direct challenge to what it says in Exodus 12. The answer is not the child's. The child's question is literally, as you said, what it says in Exodus 12:26, and you should say, then you should give an answer, and you should talk about what the sacrifice of Pesach means. So this is very odd. It's beginning to seem more and more odd to me.
Yeah, as I said, in Exodus, it's a perfectly legitimate question.
Yeah, and it gets an answer.
And therefore seeing it. So what one can say, as you're saying here, we're actually not fulfilling the commandment that we were told in Exodus to do, to simply give an answer. Yes, Clint?
Because the wicked child is singling out this person at the exclusion of everybody else?
He's not singling anyone, he's saying lachem, which is in the plural, just exactly as the wise child. There is no difference there. Carol actually, I don't know if you looked at the Hebrew, but you read it correctly when you analyzed that. Anyone else wants to say something? Yes, Ellen.
Because they both say it the same way to you and they don't include themselves. My question is, who is differentiating which child is wise and which child is wicked? Because they both, I mean, who's doing that? They're both ending in you. So neither child is including themselves in the mix, but one of them gets to be called wise and the other is wicked. So it's very subjective. I'm wondering where the judgment is coming from.
We'll get there in 1 minute, please.
Your original question was, why are the rabbis putting this in here? The only thing, so if it's in there, it's meant to teach us something. Would it be to teach us this is not what we're supposed to be doing? This is not, simply because a child asks a more articulate question versus a child who asks a more simple, direct question. We are not to be doing these things to the people. We are to answer them and treat them the same. So they're giving you an example of what not to do. And that's the only thing I can come up to is, why would the rabbis put that in there?
So we have here two things, and with those two things I'll conclude. And actually, I'm not going to add anything because you guys already said it all. One, I agree with Ellen. You were not the only one who said that, but you were the last one to say it, so I'll give you the credit. There's a premise to begin with that one child is wise, one child is wicked, one child is simple, and one child doesn't know how to ask questions. So the kids are labeled to begin with. I learned it from my teacher of blessed memory, Rabbi Richard Hirsch, who died this year, who always said, it's never about the question, it's always about the person. That person is already labeled wicked. How many times we get in the workplace the same comment from two different people, and one of them we smile at that comment, and the other one that says to us, it could be Benji would come to me and would say to me, great sermon, and I would say, oh, thank you. And then someone else will say, and I say, that must have been cynical. He was undermining what I said. That person is never giving me a compliment. I know that they don't like me. How many times we are labeling people, and then it doesn't matter what they ask. It doesn't matter what they say. And I'm going to say what Louis has just said to us. Again, we don't have the tone. So maybe the wicked child was sarcastic. Maybe Ted was correct and is correct, and he was rude, and the question was asked in a rude manner. We don't have that. And the rabbis knew that we're not going to have that context. So all we know is that this is a direct quote from the book of Exodus. It's a perfectly legitimate question there. The answer is extremely harsh, and I tend to agree with Louis that the reason that the rabbis are putting there is to teach us not to label people and not to go and immediately somebody opens their mouth to say nothing good will come from them, only evil will come from that person. So that must be the wrong question, and I will shun them away. And we have 20 more minutes, so we're going to look at another text, a text about Rabbi Yirmiyah. There's a series of stories about Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah is one of those students, I'm sure you never met such a student, one of those annoying students that when the teacher teaches, they always challenge the teacher, and not always in a good way, okay? I see a few teachers here, so you have experience in that the student that always stops you in the middle of the lesson plan asking about some minutia thing or something that is actually not part of where you are intending to go, or saying some annoying thing and getting you totally off track. So Rabbi Yirmiyah is portrayed in those series of stories that, by the way, you can fill the library of the temple with scholarly research about the questions of Rabbi Yirmiyah. So he's portrayed as one of those students that always asks those questions. We will look at the second text.
Okay, sorry.
The text that comes right after the Mechilta. It's from the Babylonian Talmud of Rosh Hashanah, which makes it very fitting. And it's fitting on two levels there. First of all, I want us to remember again that actually rabbinical literature is about asking questions, and there are other rabbis there that are questioning. The other thing that I want us to remember, that there's a back and forth here. I want us to know there's a back and forth here between two rabbis. One is Rabbi Yirmiyah, and the other is Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera is the teacher of Rabbi Yirmiyah. So we have, even though they're not in the classroom anymore, but we have that student-teacher challenge, okay? So let's say that I don't know, we're sitting in the Reform movement, in the CCAR, the Union of Reform Rabbis, challenging something, and everyone is equal, but there are people there who taught other people, who are the rabbis of other people. So there is that tension between a teacher and a student, even though they're not a teacher and a student anymore. So that's part of the dynamic of that story. The other thing that I want to say before we read, since it's kind of a complex, halachic, a Jewish law discussion there, that actually is very relevant for us this year. The rabbis try to regulate every situation in our lives, okay? Jewish law is creating tens of thousands of laws trying to kind of imagine every possible situation in life. What happens at every possible situation? And here they're dealing on what happens in a sabbatical year, okay? Every 7 years, you know, every 7 days, we have the Shabbat. We have a day of rest. We're not supposed to work. We're supposed to rest and enjoy the seventh day, the Shabbat. In the land of Israel, every 7 years has a sabbatical year, a year of rest. It comes from the book of Leviticus, from the Torah portion, Behar, and we're told to have a sabbatical year. In that year, you're not supposed to cultivate the land, and you're not supposed to make profit from the fruit of the land. You're allowed to enjoy the fruits. That means, let's say that I have an orchard, I can eat, but I'm not allowed to pick and sell the fruits. I'm not allowed to make any profit. Now, the question here, which is a very important question, is you're making your livelihood out of agriculture, and it's relevant to us because we're in a sabbatical year. Okay, if you didn't know that, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, we begin a sabbatical year, and the sabbatical year will end on the eve of Rosh Hashanah of 5,783, okay? It's from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. It's the Jewish year. It's not from January 1st to December, whatever amount of days we have in December. It's from the eve of Aleph Tishrei till the end of Elul of this year. Okay, so we have a sabbatical year, and the rabbis are asking, but what about things that I plant at the end of the sabbatical year and I prophesize from their fruits in the year that is already the 8th year? It's not the sabbatical year, okay? Let's say, for instance, my business is peppers and cucumbers, okay? That's what I make my living in farmer markets in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, it's not in Louisville, it's only in Israel, okay? In Israel, cucumbers and peppers. You cannot plant them at the beginning of Tishrei. You have to plant them before, so you will, I think so, by the way, I'm not sure, so don't argue with me on that, but let's assume. You plant them in Av, and you reap them in Cheshvan or Kislev, okay, or whatever. But so what happens? Am I allowed to plant cucumbers and peppers towards the end of the sabbatical year and sell them at the beginning of the 8th year? And actually what they're arguing here is, what's the cutoff, okay? But what's the time in the sabbatical year that I can actually start planting? Because if there's no cutoff, and the answer is you cannot do anything in the sabbatical year, that means that we're extending that year into at least 6 more months. Because that means that some things that need to be planted ahead are not going to be planted. And some things, even not even an entire other year. And that's too much of a loss. So it's actually a huge issue if you're making your livelihood from agriculture in the land of Israel. And we're talking at a time that all of them are making their livelihood. And unlike Kentucky, that has warehouses with a climate that is under control and people are growing vegetables and fruits there, in the land of Israel in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, there's no such thing. They're dependent on the weather. So this is a crucial question, actually, okay? Maybe the lesson is not that relevant, but the lesson about what kinds of questions are okay and what are not is relevant to today. So with all that in mind, let's go there and let's see the dynamics and what happens and what can we learn from that. Can I ask Ted to be our reader? Ted, can you read to us?
Yes, gladly. How much of it should I read?
I'll stop you when I need you to stop. I'm going to let you read quite a lot.
Rabbi Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, and they brought it in the name of Rabbi Yossi Hagili. Scripture says at the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of release of the Feast of Booths. What does the year of release have to do with the Feast of Booths?
Okay, so let's stop there for a minute. That's the first thing. Okay, they're quoting from the Torah, from Deuteronomy 31 and 10, and they're saying this verse doesn't make sense. Okay, we just said the sabbatical year starts at Rosh Hashanah and ends before Rosh Hashanah. How do they get to Sukkot? What does Sukkot have to do with it? Okay, we'll see what they learn from that. But their first thing is they're questioning actually the biblical text. What does Sukkot have to do with it? Okay, what is Sukkot doing here? Please continue.
The Feast of Booths falls in the 8th year. Rather, it teaches you that for all grain that grew 1/3 in the 7th year before the new year, you must behave toward it with the customs of the 7th year in the 8th year. Rabbi
Okay,
Zira.
Stop here. So what are they learning from this thing about Sukkot? Okay. Please don't ask me how do they learn that. You know what? Ask me. I'll explain. What are they learning? They're actually creating the cutoff. They're saying if I plant a cucumber and up to 1/3 of it grew during the 7th year, that's kosher. I can sell it. If more than 1/3 of it grew in the 7th year, in the sabbatical year, that's not kosher. That means that it's already a fruits of sabbatical year, which I can eat, but I cannot sell. I cannot make a living with. Now, how do they get to that? Who knows? The rabbis are in the business of creating what we call halachic fictions, okay? You have to make a living. You have to solve problems. So you make up or you come up with something that would actually give a good answer to your constituency. The rabbis are not in the business of creating problems to the farmers. They're trying to solve the problem of the farmers. So they're saying to them, you know what? You can plant whatever you want during the sabbatical year, as long as less than 1/3 of it will grow at the sabbatical year, and the rest will grow after. How do they come up with it? They say, because it says Sukkot. That means that in Sukkot you will ripe what you planted. That means that 2/3 grew up from the first day of the year till the end of Sukkot, and the rest grew up before that. How do they make that calculation? Who knows? And we'll see soon the problem that will come here. Now, I want you to jump a little bit in the text because we're short in time, and go to Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zira. Do you see that? The
Yes.
text? Okay,
Yes.
then you find it to us. Thank you. And can you take the text a little bit up? Yes, please. Read from there.
Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zira, and did the rabbis know how to distinguish between 1/3 growth and less than 1/3? He
What
said,
is Rabbi, stop. What is Rabbi Yirmiyah says?
How the hell do they know from 1/3 to 1/2 or 1/8 or 1/4?
Yes. Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying, are you kidding me? Like you really can go out and measure and say, this cucumber grew more than 1/3, so it's not kosher. This is less than 1/3. It is kosher. And it is actually even saying, and did the rabbis know? It's like saying, you rabbis, you don't know anything about agriculture. But what are you talking about? I mean, this is nonsense, okay? Or you could say even BS, okay? This is nonsense. He is questioning the entire discussion between him. Okay. Please, Ted, now I need some dramatic voice here.
my problem is pronouncing correctly that last word, but we'll get there. He said to him, haven't I told you not to take yourself outside of Hilaka?
Okay, please stop there. So why a dramatic thing? What is actually Rabbi, the he here is Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera, the teacher or the former teacher, is saying to the former student, what is he actually saying to you? Saying to him?
Ask that question.
Didn't I tell you already? It's even more. Louis said that he said, don't ask that question, but he's saying more than that. He said, didn't I already told you? Haven't I told you already not to ask these kinds of questions when it comes to halacha, to Jewish law? Okay? Please go on, finish this text, and then we'll go back and ask ourselves, what's the problem with the question? And maybe with the answer, please.
All the measurements of the sages are like that. One immerses in a ritual bath, 40 sikot in 40 sikot, minus a kortof. One cannot immerse. An egg transmits food impurity. An egg amount minus a sesame seed does not transmit food impurity. 3 by 3 tefakim transmits impurity by treading. 3 by 3 minus 1 hair does not transmit impurity by treading.
So what is Rabbi Zera saying here? That's the end of the text. It's the end of this complex halachic thing. What is he saying? All our measurements. Yes, please, Carol.
He's saying it's all arbitrary, so just accept it and move on.
He's saying even more than that. Okay, you're right. It's all arbitrary. Okay, it's all made up things. But it also say it's all things that you can't really quantitate. Okay, when you're going to the mikveh, are you actually going to let's say, Carol, I'll pick on you since you answered. You're going to the mikveh here in Louisville. They have this whole system of bringing rainwater into the mikveh. How can you tell, okay, whether the amount of rainwater in the water there makes it kosher or not? Okay, there has to be a certain percentage. He actually gives you the percentage. If it's less than that, then the mikveh is not kosher. Are you actually going to go there and take the water and send them into a lab and check what's water that came from rain and what came from the faucet, and only then you're going to bathe in the mikveh? That's ridiculous. The same thing is with an egg, okay? An egg is impure if less than a sesame seed makes it, if more than a sesame seed. Are you going to actually check that? You look at it and you assume, okay, there's a small blood stain here. I can hardly see it. I'll take off my glasses. I won't see it at all. It's kosher. And if you want to be ultra-Orthodox, then you'll say, no, it's not kosher. It's more than a sesame. I mean, those all are arbitrary, and those all are actually halachic fictions. That they're not really something that you can measure. Just like Louis said about the measurement, you're not going to go to your cucumber field and start measuring that everything is less than a third before we hit Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year. So what makes in the eyes of Rabbi Zera the question illegitimate? What's the problem there? What's the problem with Rabbi Yirmiyah's question?
Is he challenging the rules?
He's challenging the rules. Kate, please.
He's challenging someone who used to be his teacher. Yeah, he's challenging his authority.
Okay, never challenge your rabbi. Never challenge someone who used to be your teacher. Yes, I like that. That is very nice. And by the way, when you become a rabbi yourself, you're allowed to challenge your former rabbi. So as much as I would like to buy into it, that is not actually the thing here. But obviously, he is still speaking like he's the teacher, okay? He's saying, haven't I told you already? Please, David, you wanted to say something.
It's the same as the first story. Whether the one boy is wise and one is wicked is arbitrary. They're just trying to make a point.
I think that you're right. He's not labeled here, Rabbi Yirmiyah. And in the Talmud, one of the problems that we have, we don't know what's the beginning and what's the end. Okay, we have about 30 to 50 stories about Rabbi Yirmiyah asking an annoying question. But they're not labeled, okay? That there's no date. This was in this date and that was in this date. So you cannot put a chronology here, okay? I brought here, I think, 4 or 5 texts, all of them, except for the first one about the wicked child and the wise child, all of them are stories with Rabbi Yirmiyah. I am not sure that they're in the correct order, okay? It's just a guess, whether this is the first time that we have an explosion with Rabbi Yirmiyah, or is it not the first time? This is all but a guess. We don't have dates in the Talmud when those things happened. But we have that feeling that this is something that is it's not a feeling. I highlighted that line in yellow for a reason. This is happening for a long time. I told you already not to ask these questions. Now, we don't have enough time to go to the next text, but I can tell you the next text I brought, because it's actually a question that Rabbi Yirmiyah is thrown out of the house of learning because of asking it. While in another part in the Talmud, someone else is asking a similar question and gets a wonderful answer, a page long of answer. So I think, again, it's about labeling the person. We're going to cut here. I see Rabbi Rapport giving me the evil eye at the end of the Klein Center. So we're going to take a few minutes break. But before we go to the break, anybody wants to say something, ask something, so you won't say that I also shunned you out of questions. And at least in this session, I'm not going to shun anyone from asking questions. Please, Clint.
I kind of skimmed over the last ones, and between the 3 with Rabbi Yirmiyah, he seems to get caught up in these little tiny details for things rather than the big picture of why you're doing this in the first place.
Yes, so he's into Minusha, and I actually said that at the beginning in the introduction. He's one of those students that always is into Minusha, which you need a lot of patience as a teacher for the students that are into that Minusha and are stopping the flow of the class. You know what? I'll say something about the question that he asked here, not about other questions. You could say that this is a totally legitimate question of a rabbi who's actually worried about the system of the rabbis and how they interpret the Torah. Johanna, with the story of the wicked child, said to us, this is actually going against what the Torah said. In Exodus, that was the question that the child is supposed to ask, and that child is supposed to get an answer. So actually the rabbis are breaking a law from the Torah. So you could say also here, Rabbi Yirmiyah is genuinely concerned about the system of the rabbis. He's not challenging them. He's not mocking them. He's not saying you don't understand anything. It's a genuine concern. And I actually think, reading ahead to the happy ending of the stories about Rabbi Yirmiyah, that is the case. And again, I think it's criticism, rabbinical criticism, in this case on themselves, on labeling someone, on labeling a student as the Minusha trouble work, making a one and shushing them because they have no patience to them. Anyone else? Please, Johanna.
At the end of that text, whose voice that was, the sentence that begins with all the sages, all the comments of the sages are like that, and then the examples. Whose voice is that? Is that another voice, a commentary voice? Is that Yirmiyam? Is it Zera? I don't know.
He said to him, is Rabbi Zera. It's clear.
Oh, I see. It's all Rabbi Zera who says all that. That's first the heaven I told you, and then also all the comments are like that. Okay.
Yes, yes, yes. Which is, by the way, true. All the rabbinical measurements, and the rabbis are very much into measurement. You can spend a few years just studying texts about measurements. All of them are arbitrary and fictional, and most of them don't really make sense. Well, Shana Tova, everyone. Ask questions, don't be afraid, and we'll take a 10 minutes break, and then Rabbi Rapport will be with you for the next class.
Thank you for a great class.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you?
Can we hear each other?
We
Yay!
can if we unmute, yes.
Let's all talk.
We can do that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 We're coming live. Benji had 2 o'clock on and that just confused him for a second there.
Don't need to
Slide's gonna get projected.
join the Zoom room.
Yay!
Oh, I'm not going directly in anymore. Okay.
Oh, Benji's so quick. It's already fixed.
There you go.
Mod is having trouble getting the mic.
But Barb, there's Barb. Barb.
Benji,
Yep.
it's not in my calendar.
Okay.
So is it a scheduled meeting?
I will add it to your calendar right now.
Oh, it's a dead doubtless Ted. He has all the ticking clocks. Everybody else is being so polite and quiet.
Well, I think it's because we're all hungry.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah.
At least that's my excuse and I'm sticking with it.
Just give me the number.
Yep, I put it in your calendar, but I can give you the number 2.
Okay.
Let me know when you're ready.
A lot of my calendar hasn't refreshed.
Hi, Linda.
We have to restart that.
Hi, Ted. Hi, everybody.
Great to see you.
It is great to see you. Hi, Kay.
Hi, Linda.
Hey.
So I'll give you the numbers 567. 120. 177. That's it.
Hello, everybody.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi,
Hi,
Nikki.
Jack. Hi, Nikki.
Hi.
Bye.
Are there so many people here because everybody's scared to go in person, or is everybody just happily
Yes.
sitting at home?
Oh, there's Tom.
Scared to go in person.
Scared to go in person.
Is your sister here?
I don't know.
I didn't see her.
I am here.
Ted, I know a lot of people here that are having breakthrough COVID cases after
Hey,
vaccine.
Ted's sister.
Yes,
Absolutely. It's great
I'm
to
here.
see her.
It would be a long drive from Florida. I live in Florida, so I'm doing mine.
Started yet.
Granddaughter Rachel has breakthrough.
Susan Allen.
Yeah, most people are muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
He's going right to the learning, so. I think you want to mute us again?
Yeah.
Do we see something on your screens?
Yes, we do.
Good. You
Yeah.
have something as big or as large if you want to see other people's faces better. Feel free.
Oh, Rabbi, tilt your thing down because you have a good shot of your chin.
Oh, good point.
Hey, Kate, I was at McDonough this weekend.
You were?
Yeah,
Was it a
my
reunion?
50th reunion, yeah.
Oh,
It's
that's
great.
so cool.
I'll send you pictures.
That'd be great.
My dad came back from his 50th high school reunion.
Yeah.
What was it like? He said, it was great, except for there were all these old people.
Yeah.
He couldn't figure out how that happened. I thought that was funnier before my 50th started approaching.
Yeah.
Right, we all thought that was funnier years ago.
I can't figure out how you've been here 33 years when you're only 35.
Right. I'm still the new young
Me
rabbi.
either.
Right.
Me either, Carol. Hard to believe.
There are still members of our congregation who are quite certain that Dr. Waller is still in charge. You know, Dr. Waller in certain ways is in charge. So welcome, everybody. The name of our second Yom Kippur educational is to know what we say when we pray. I'm glad you joined in. I'm glad to see all your faces. I'm glad we're staying home and being safe. I'm glad to see someone actually came physical virtual. We're going to be talking today about the history of our congregation, the history of Reformed Jewish liturgy. Who's giving me little horns there in the darkness? Nice to see you. The history of our congregation, the history of Reformed Judaism, and the history of prayer and how prayer has evolved using the examples of many of the most well-known and beloved sections of the High Holiday Liturgy. The name of this class, to know what we say when we pray, comes from the first Reformed Jewish liturgy, not lessons on liturgy, that were written by Joel Grishaber for the religious schools of the Reformed movement. To know what we say when we pray was like the model of, what does it mean to be a Reformed Jew in prayer? It was the foundational principle of Reformed Judaism, which began as a prayer revolution originally. And within that revolution and continuing through all of the prayer books and evolutions of our service, that understanding what we're saying, that sets us apart from that sort of rote memorization of just doing it because it's tradition, has become almost a symbol of reform. Before we start with how did Reform liturgy or services change, we have to start talking about what services are. So a very brief orientation to what is a Jewish service? One could say that all services are the same because there's a certain structure that makes something a service. If it's a service and you walk in, before the prayers start, we rise for the Baruch Hu. That never comes at the end of the service. We never skip that. That's like an essential first beat that opens the door to prayer. If we're singing the Baruch Hu, it's not going to be very long before we get to the Shema. Okay, if we're doing the Shema, you know that there'll be "and you shall love" that comes after that. You know that there'll be some prayers in between. We'll probably sing Mi Chamocha. Okay, one way or another. We'll stand up and say some prayers called the Tefillah. We'll sit down. Other things might happen, but for sure we're going to end up at the Ark for the Aleinu, and then we're going to have the Kaddish. There's a basic structure that's always the same. All services are the same. But if all services were the same literally, even in a traditional setting, then all services would also be boring. So even in a traditional setting, all services are the same. Those things that make it a service, they remain the same. But then there's this other set of things that roll in and slide in between all those we always knew we were going to do them things. Those are called the matbeh, or the skeleton of the prayer service. And they're unique to whatever that particular service is about. So it's Friday night, we're having services. What do we do before the Baruch? It tells us this is Friday night services. I mean, if you lost track of time and you walked into services and they started off services before the Baruch Hu, what would you hear on a Friday night?
Candles and Kiddush.
Right. And we don't light candles in the morning because it's morning services. So you know that it's either Shabbat or a holiday if we're doing candles and Kiddush. Very good, John. All right, if it's Friday night though, after candles and Kiddush, we're going to sing something.
Lechadodi.
Lechadodi, which is specifically a song for welcoming the Sabbath. So there'll be unique things like that. If it's Saturday morning, there'll be a Torah service, and that kind of slides its way in after the Tefillah and before we get to the Aleinu. In Reformed congregations, and on Friday evening, that's where the sermon goes. If there's a holiday, there'll be different things that sort of drop in. So all things are the same and all things are different. And this keeps things structured in a way that makes it strike a chord that helps us feel at home, that lets us know where we are if we show up late. Not that that would ever happen to a Jew, that they'll show up late for something, but also it gives you that familiarity if you know what's going to happen in the service. So it's not like a sudden thing. I like going to services in churches and in mosques. I don't know enough about Islamic prayer to know the order, but there is one. I've had enough experiences in Protestant churches that you never know what's going to happen. It's always creative, it's always beautiful, it's always wonderful, but you don't know what's coming next. And that's kind of unsettling to me. I don't really know what's coming next in services from a Jewish perspective, but I know certain things that'll give me signposts that make me comfortable and familiar with the service. So amidst that basic balance, we're going to look today at what makes high holiday services. What are those unique things? So we're not going to be talking about the Baruch Hu and the Shema and things that we're familiar with if you come to services regularly, but rather we're going to be talking about what makes a uniquely high holiday service and how these things changed and developed both in Reform liturgy and over the ages. So the category of what's different for the holidays, for Rosh Hashanah, include the melodies. There's a certain core kind of sound to the music that kind of permeates the melodies. There are so it's the same words, they're just sung differently. There are things called piyutim, which are medieval poems of praise. They're creative poems that during the Middle Ages we began to see inserted. They became popular. It's hard to say popular because most of them are pretty morose, but they fit the times. It was a dark time. There was a lot of death. There were plagues. We can relate on that regard. There were pogroms and there were crusades. Thankfully, we don't have to relate too directly with that. And these poems became beloved and they became part of the service. There's Avinu Malkeinu. You probably heard of that, yeah? That became sort of like the great popular one. It goes back in its use sometime. We'll talk about some of these in particular, that one in particular. There's the blowing of the shofar, which is obviously unique to Rosh Hashanah. And then there's a part in the service called the Musaf service, which not many of you probably have experienced if you're not in a more traditional congregation, because it mirrors the sacrificial services of the temple times. We don't have those in Reformed Judaism. It hasn't since the very beginning. But the part we liked about the Musaf service in Rosh Hashanah was the part that had the three big shofar services, Malchu, Yod, Zichronot, and Shofarot. And those all found their way into other services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, the things that are new, you probably have heard of, things like Kol Nidrei. That one's so well known, we actually call the service the Kol Nidrei services. Even Lechadodi, which we all love, we don't call that Lechadodi services. So you've hit the big time when it's Kol Nidrei services. Vidui, which are two different confessionals, the Al Chet Shechatanu Lefanecha one, and the Ashamnu, that's the alphabetic acrostic. Unatana Tokep, that's the one about the Book of Life. I did a whole lesson on that 2 years ago, so I figure we don't need to talk about that again. Avodah, which is, again, the section that has to do with the sacrifices for Rosh Hashanah. Ele Ezkara, which some of you may remember from the old Gates of Repentance, that afternoon service where we read all the martyrs of our people from the time of the temple forward. That was always our least attended service. Yizkor, the service of remembrance, which is started in the medieval age, and Nila, which is the closing service. And those are all obviously just unique for Yom Kippur. So the prayers that we're going to be using examples come from these editions, the Rosh Hashanah and the Yom Kippur pieces. So now we know what prayers we're talking about. Let's just take a moment and talk about where prayers come from. So this is sort of the mommy, where do prayers come from conversation that we're going to have right now. Prayers come from everywhere. The idea that the Reform movement invented creative services and creative prayers kind of misses any study of the prayer service. The first prayers, our first most beloved prayers, the oldest prayers we know, are older than the Bible. And I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but let me walk you through this. According to biblical scholars, if you believe the theories of who wrote the Bible and the JEPD documentary hypothesis, the Bible was written in the form that we have it, actually written down around the 5th century. And they were pretty sure about that, which means, in particular, we're talking about the Torah, was written around the year 500. And then, a couple of decades ago, in a place called Ketef Chinom, which is a small burial spot outside the city of Jerusalem. It's now in the city of Jerusalem, but it was outside the ancient walls. A new set of graves were found, as in a sealed vault. So from an archaeological perspective, this means it's totally datable. There were other things there that could be radiocarbon dated, and there were two pieces of jewelry, which turned out to be scrolls that were wrapped up, silver scrolls that were wrapped up in a tube, sort of like if you go to the Sisterhood gift shop, I see Karen nodding there. If you were stopped by the Sisterhood gift shop, you wanted to buy them so that you could wear, they look just like that. But instead of being a small like cylinder with a parchment scroll, which would have long before that disintegrated and be gone, they were like the silver itself had been rolled out in a sheet, and on it was written, "May God bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you. May God's face be lifted unto you and grant you peace." Have you heard that prayer before? A few times during the High Holy Days, I imagine, and you'll be hearing it again. That was positively identified in an archaeological find at the year 700 BCE, or 200 years before the book of Numbers, where that prayer comes from, was written. Now, someone want to explain that to me? How could that prayer be older than the biblical source from which it's taken? Any thoughts?
Well, wasn't this all oral before it was written? So it could have come from the oral tradition, even though it wasn't written down at that time.
Okay, thank you, Marty. That's the answer I'm hoping for. There are other answers. One is the biblical scholars who told us that the Bible wasn't written until 500 are obviously wrong. That could be one answer. Another could be that the archaeologists who found it and positively identified its date with radiocarbon proof is wrong. But the better answer is that prayer comes before our written scripture. Before there was a Torah that you could take out of the ark and read, that had all of these stories and lessons and parts that got woven together into what became the Bible. The really important ones were already there. This prayer is older than the Torah. The Torah is quoting the prayer, not the other way around. So this means this prayer comes from a time like of history, nearer when it actually happened, being passed down, orally, because in a memorized form, because it was so beloved. So I guess some prayers come from the beginning, would be the beginning of that. I don't know if anybody can read that. That's old ancient chisel script, but trust me, that really says the priestly benediction. And there were two of them. So another answer for where prayers come from is from the Bible. Many of our prayers, even today, if you look at Mishkan Hanefesh or Mishkan Tefillah or any of the new Reform prayer books, underneath the line at the bottom of the page, you'll see biblical quotations, little citations telling you where in the Bible these prayers may find their roots. And three really famous ones is the one we find in the Passover Haggadah. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down into Egypt, sojourned there few in number. He became there a great nation, mighty and populous. This is like a paragraph long prayer that you were supposed to recite at the beginning of Passover. It's the beginning of the Passover Haggadah, and still the core of it today. The lesson was in it. So that was taken right out of Numbers, where it was found, and placed into the Haggadah. As the Haggadah grew, all kinds of new things came around it, but that one came directly from the Bible. You may have noticed during services this morning, we came upon this Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh prayer. Holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts. The whole earth is filled with your glory. That's a quotation from Isaiah. And there's other prophets who are quoted in the Kedusha in that psalm. In the oldest prayer we know, the oldest part of the Bible, the written Bible, is the Mi Chamocha, who is like you among the gods that are worshipped, who is like you, majestic in holiness, awe-inspiring, doing wonders. That's probably the oldest statement of God belief, anywhere, older even than the Shema. So the original prayers, we're being buzzed by a plane here. The original prayers were, Kate, did you have a question, or are you just like stretching your hand? Stretching your hand, okay. But this is just to remind you I can see you. Okay. The oldest prayers started off just being quotations from Bible. People, who could not come to the temple, even Bible times, there were synagogues. They went to services, and the services were, as best we understand, roughly structured around reading quotations from Torah. It was more, that's why the original synagogue was called a Beit Midrash, a house of study, rather than a house of prayer. Prayer originally was Torah. And the original prayers then became at first just quotations from Bible. People would come together and study. That was, sort of the equivalent of prayer. And then the service itself started to be created as people wove together the sections they liked, connecting them on themes, finding multiple, things about God's holiness that would be worked together in quotations. So they became sort of like a quilt. Prayer, the prayer part, the prayer writer, or the liturgical part, was the person stitching together the quilt. But the pieces themselves, they were mostly taken from Bible. The prayers we think are the prayers, like the Shema, that's a pretty important one, yeah? Raise your hand if you think the Shema is an important prayer. Okay, if your hand isn't up, you're not paying attention. Very good, okay, thank you. Shema is an important prayer. It's called the Watchword of Our Faith. It's the center of the service right now. But actually, we know when it actually entered the service. The Shema was not part of the original service in that pre-biblical, when there was still a temple time. Shema became part of the service sometime around the 1st century, around 100 this side of 0, which is, it's only 2,000 years old. I understand that's quite old. But the parts that were quotations from Bible, largely speaking, they were in the service before, like the part from Isaiah that says, holy, holy, holy. That whole part of the service that surrounds the Shema, the Baruch Hu, on one side, Michamocha, all those prayers that go with the Shema, they were all there way before the Shema was. We used to say the 10 Commandments then. There was a formal recitation of the 10 Commandments right where the Shema is today, the Shema and the Havdalah. And over time, people became a little too attached to those 10 Commandments, like those were the only ones they needed to do. And there are another 603 we should be talking about. Some of them are really important. So there was a decision by the rabbis in the time of the Mishnah to actually take the 10 Commandments out of the service and put the Shema in there instead. Now, that's a pretty momentous change to services, if you imagine. I mean, as far as we know, service has been going on for a good 400 years before that. And someone took the center of the service because they decided there was something better. So as I get further in this conversation about how reformers changed the service, oh my God, let's just remember that the service itself has been changing for thousands of years, even in the most critical of ways. Yeah, Mike.
After the Shema, how did the Baruch Hu get in there?
The Baruch Hu, you mean the Baruch Shem Kavod, that thing?
Yes.
There's whole stories on that, we have no idea. When there's 3 good stories, did everybody hear that question? How did the Baruch Shem Kavod, because that's not in the Shema. In the Bible. In the Torah, in Deuteronomy, it goes right from Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad to Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. And that extra line that's in the prayer book is just there. It's probably one of those call and response things, like, if you've been to traditional congregations, when you do the Kaddish, people will be saying, the Amens, or the Baruch Shem Kavod, the Baruch Hus. It was like a call and response. And it was just saying, yeah, I'm here. But that's not a good answer. So there's all kinds of stories. My favorite is that the Shema isn't really about us, the people of Israel. It's about the guy named Israel. This is a midrash from about the year 500. When Israel, our ancestor, was dying, he called around his bed all of his sons, and he said to them, listen, Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. They said that, he asked them to carry on the tradition, and they said, listen, Israel, like, don't worry, Dad. Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And he very quietly, and that's the way it's done, except for on Yom Kippur, in traditional congregations, he said, blessed is God's glorious name forever and ever, sort of as the thank you for them carrying it on, which is a lovely story, totally made up, but a very old, totally made up story, which makes it definitely true. Okay.
So my question is,
yeah.
Why is it that in more Orthodox congregations, which I have the misfortune to belong to one up here, is it said out loud on Yom Kippur, but not said out loud the rest of the year?
It's a way of making Yom Kippur special. But I mean, just like there isn't a halachic reason for it being there in the first place, there isn't a logical, rational, or halachic reason for saying it louder than it's just a tradition. But it's one of those things, like, those little, in the fine print, we skip them all year. But on that one time, on Shabbat Shuvah, we say it. Or those aggravating insertions that we have to be remembering on, like in the tefillah, that we have to remember to be inserting. It's our way of regularly reminding us, oh, this is a special day. It'd make much better sense that like on Rosh Chodesh for the new moon, there was like one prayer that you said, but by inserting it into your regular rhythm, it makes you stop your regular rhythm and like be aware that something's new. That's my best rabbi excuse.
Good, because I get checked from my rabbi up here because I have a habit of saying it out loud and he kind of shakes his finger.
Yeah. We have a few members of our congregation who show up in tennis shoes for the high holidays because of that tradition about not wearing leather or coming barefoot, you know, and I look at that and go, oh, what a lovely tradition. And other people are going like, put shoes on, you know, it's just a matter of context, I guess. Okay, I got to go back to, there we go. So the last lesson on where prayers come from that I wanted to share with you is my favorite prayer, Lechadodi. This is like the perfect prayer. It's written, it's in Hebrew, even in English, actually, it's beautiful. But the Hebrew is so precisely written in its poetics that almost any melody will fit with it. And, you know, that's because it's such a lyric, beautiful work and the mystical imagery, and everybody loves this poem. It's only 500 years old. It's one of the newest additions to the prayer. It was written by Shlomo Alkabetz. We know that because he signed his name in the service through the acrostic. You can see where the yad is pointing. That's the first word, Shamor V'Zachor. That shin is the first letter of his name, Shlomo. And then right below, where like the pinky of the yad is the lamed for Likrad Shabbat. That's the second letter of his name. You can see the mem underneath it and the hey underneath it. That's Shlomo. And it goes on with his last name underneath it, Shlomo Halev. That kind of writing was not at all common in the Bible, at least for prayers. You see it in the Psalms. We're going to be looking at some acrostics that are written that way, where you use the letters of the alphabet. But this particular prayer was written along with pretty much all of the Friday night service by the mystics in Sfat in the year 1500 or so, in the 1560s or so. So that part of the service is, you know, relatively new addition. To give you a context, that's 500 years ago, and the Reform movement is more than 200 years old itself. So it's not been so long since we literally added things that we consider essential parts of the service. Imagine, for instance, if the Reform movement decided that we weren't going to sing Lechadodi because we don't like this guy. That would have been thought of as radical. But, you know, the early Reformers would only have been looking back, you know, a few centuries in order to change them. Okay, so we know what services are, and we know how prayers come to be. We're now going to talk about how Reformed liturgy, or the structure of Reformed prayer, came to be. The first Reformed prayer book, and I say this with great pride because I didn't study this in school. Okay, in school they'll tell you Reformed Judaism came from Germany. They all developed it. The Americans just sort of borrowed it when the German wave came here. That's the lessons that you get when you go to rabbi school. Truth is, before the Germans ever thought of anything called Reform, the first Reformed prayer book was written here in America, the city of Charleston, at Beth Elohim, which is one of the oldest oldest synagogues in America. Beth Elohim in Charleston was like the birthplace of American Reform. And in the 1820s, beginning in 1824, in this prayer book, which was written in 1825, the Reformed Society of Israelites was formed. It was like every congregation in America, they did not have a rabbi yet. Like every congregation in America, they were what might be broadly defined as Sephardic Reform. They weren't Sephardic; they were mostly Germans, okay, who would come, you know, in the age early on when Germans were coming to America. But the structure of American religious life had been built by the Sephardic Orthodox community, and although they were now 3 or 4 generations in America and speaking English, and you know, they were still the people who were in charge of the synagogues. So this synagogue had a revolt. A majority of the members of the synagogue said that they wanted a new service. They wanted a service that had some English in it. They wanted a sermon that just English of the same prayers. They were okay with the prayers, just we'd like to know what they meant. So you see how to know what we say when we pray goes back a long way. They wanted music by people who could actually sing, nothing against the people who were, you know, chanting and davening, but that was not music. They wanted music by American standards, and they wanted a sense of prayer that was relevant to their lives. So the majority got together and they voted a resolution in their synagogue, but the majority rule didn't really exist in America in the 1820s in synagogues. The Ma'amad, which was sort of like the board, which was made up of about 25 people, all of whom were pretty traditional, said, very interesting, no. And this no went on for a long time until the Reformed Society of Israelites left. And they sort of met at a school nearby, and that went on for a couple of years. And then there was a terrible fire in Charleston. Let me just make sure you understand the context. Charleston was the largest Jewish population in America. More Jews lived in Charleston than lived any other city. I'm talking New York, which was around at the time. So there was a fire that swept through Charleston and burnt down the entire city. And the whole city had to be reconstructed. And then they needed to build a new synagogue. And then they needed to get together and decide who was going to build it and pay for it. And then majority ruled. And then the group came forward and said, why should we have two different synagogues? We can't afford to build the one. We're pleased to work together. All we'd like is an organ. And they'd up the ante to an organ, a professional choir. Penina Moiza, who's a wonderful poet, has written many songs that we all grew up learning in our Sunday school. We'd like those to be included in the service, please. And we'd like a prayer book that at least has a translation of the other prayers. And the Ma'amad said no, and they said, okay, well, we're building the synagogue, and you can find your own. Because at that point, American democracy had moved to the point where the majority really did rule. Thomas Jefferson thought this was a wonderful idea, just as an aside. Yes.
What about the other Fighting Isaac of Albany? I thought
Fighting Isaac Mayor Wise, gave his first Reformed sermon in Charleston. Oh. That's the Reformed sermon he gave that got published in newspapers that by the time he got back to Albany, his Orthodox congregation fired him. Right. And that led to the fight. Okay, the fight started in Charleston. Okay, so the first Reformed prayer book was a prayer book that was used in Charleston, South Carolina. The silhouette you see next to it is the silhouette of Isaac Harvey, who I would say composed the prayer book. We don't have an actual picture of him. His sister made that silhouette. That's the closest we have to a picture. What you see in the book in front of you, on the right was a discourse, he was a publisher, a printer, and a journalist, that was defending the idea of reform in Judaism. And on the left is his handwritten manuscript of the first prayer book of American reform. And basically what he did was something like Jefferson's Bible, where Jefferson he didn't write his own Bible, but he cut out all the parts he didn't like. He took the prayer book and cut out all the parts he didn't like, and then he hand wrote them down, and that became the original Reformed prayer book that was used in services in Charleston long before anybody, was writing liturgy in America for Reformed Jews. The first official Reformed prayer book took a different approach. This is the prayer book of Isaac Mayor Wise, Fighting Ike, an ad for the bourbon. That's a young picture of Isaac Mayor Wise. You don't recognize him without his mutton chops. But that's about how old he was when he wrote this prayer book. The prayer book was called Minhag America, which means American custom. And it was the first printed formal prayer book that was the first effort to form the Reform movement. The first prayer book, like the first prayer came before the Bible. The first prayer book of Reform came before Reform Judaism. There were congregations which had allied themselves with this radical named Isaac Mayor Wise, who was arguing for a change. The first essential change had to do with the way we lead our services. And that service, and she's looking at me like, is he going to get to prayers? We'll get to whatever we get to. Please interrupt and we'll continue the conversation. That service basically was a traditional prayer book. He billed it as a traditional Siddur, a prayer book, except for on one side will be the Hebrew and the other side will be the English. So we'll know what we say when we pray. He didn't use those words, but that was the essential value. Now, he didn't mention that he left out those, just a few prayers nobody really liked, by which he meant the ones about sacrifices and return to the land of Israel and things like that, things you wouldn't want to see anyway. But essentially, if you went to it, the prayer service remained, in its core, the way most people were actually practicing it in America. Most people were skipping those prayers anyway, in its original form. That actual prayer book that you see sitting in the picture is in the archives of the temple, because the temple in Louisville was the first congregation in America to use Isaac Mayor Wise's prayer book in America. Even his own congregation in Cincinnati had not yet approved it when he brought copies to us in 1857 and that service began here. But again, going back to what makes for Reform liturgy, the key to his prayer book was it was a traditional prayer book, largely speaking. He was trying not to make a new movement called Reform, but to make something called American Judaism that would include all stripes. So he knew that he needed a prayer book that would have for traditional congregations all the prayers they needed. But for Reformed or more liberal-leaning congregations, those prayers could all be recited, whichever ones we wanted, in English, because they were all listed there. Why is this prayer book was the prayer book of Reformed Judaism and the growing movement until the actual founding of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and the decision to make what we now lovingly call the UPB, the Union Prayer Book. The first Union Prayer Book that was published was basically Minhag America, rebound, a couple of little editorial changes from a conference in Cleveland, and the new title Union Prayer Book, because now it was being billed as the sort of standard prayer book of Reformed Judaism. We bought that prayer book at our congregation. We were among the first to purchase it, and it was recalled. It was one of the original recalls because the Reform movement had already changed, and so long as the rest of the movements, the more traditional congregations, had left us, the more radical elements within the movement began to take hold, and a man named Rabbi David Einhorn, representing them, and Kaufman Kohler, his son-in-law, who would follow after him, had a prayer book out that was competing with Isaac Merowise's, which was in German and called Olat Tamid. It was a very unique prayer book. It's sort of the mother of our Union Prayer Book of today. It had a lot of creative prayers and very little bits of Hebrew. And at the convention of the UAHC and the CCAR, Einhorn was able to prevail to say that that should be the Union Prayer Book. And so clearly was he on that subject that he had all copies of Wise's prayer book that had already been printed, called the first edition of the Union Prayer Book, recalled and brought back at great expense. The congregations were reimbursed, and they sent what's now called the first edition of the Union Prayer Book, Einhorn's mostly English and very creative prayer book, which became the prayer book of Reformed Judaism for 75 years. We adopted that one too in 1895, along with the entire movement as soon as it was released. Now, it was viewed as incredibly radical because David Einhorn was writing prayers. Okay, and that seemed like, how could you possibly write new prayers for the prayer book? The prayer book's been around for 2,000 years. But let me mention again Lechadodi and the entire Friday night service and many of the other prayers that have been written creative prayers that were just, well, that was by real people, and these rabbis don't count. You may remember the coal miner's prayer from that prayer book, giving thanks for those who dig deep in the earth that we might be warm. And it would list an outpost far away that our freedom might be protected. They were classically American prayers. Also, among the first to adopt the next prayer book, our congregation adopted Gates of Repentance, that red-bound thing we used for a good 25 years, which was the prayer book for the High Holy Days from 1978 on forward. Gates of Repentance was sort of a parallel to the Gates of Prayer, that big blue brick that we used for 25 to 30 years here as well. It wasn't really a prayer book, it was a scrapbook. There were 10 different services, and the congregations could choose from whichever one they wanted. It weighed a ton in our hands, and we only did certain services, and other congregations only did the ones they did. It didn't really define the movement anymore because we were a very diverse group in the 70s and 80s when it came out. And finally, we arrived at Mishkan HaNefesh. That's finally we arrived at pre-COVID, but hopefully we'll get back to we can all gather together again and use our prayer books again. The editor of this one was a woman named Elise Frischman, a friend of Rabbi Gelia's, who put together what ended up being almost a 12-year process of creating the new prayer book, and created the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services we use today, which is, by Elise's definition, the most traditional prayer book Reformed Judaism has ever produced, returning to the prayer book more of the Hebrew sections of the old Machzor or traditional prayer book than we've ever used before, and also the most liberal prayer book of Reformed Judaism, with creative readings and interpretations that required 2 volumes just to get it together, because there's so many new and wonderful things written by women and men, Israelis and Americans, poetry and songs that just didn't exist when the last prayer books were written. So that gets us, we have at least 15, maybe 20 minutes to discuss the topic for today, because we now know what services are. We now know what high holiday services are, and we now know what Reformed Jewish high holiday services are about. A little about how those prayers came to be. This is the beginning of the first prayer. I'd love someone to read this, because this was written by Rabbi Adolf Moses, who was the rabbi for Isaac Bernheim, back in 1903. And this basically sums up what Reformed prayer is in a paragraph from a rabbi of the temple. Anybody want to read? If nobody raises their hand, I'm going to pick on Michael, because he's got it in front of him and he has no excuse. Linda, read. Thank you.
Judaism in America required a reform prayer book, which should respond to the ideas of American Israel, eliminating dead hopes and exploded national issues, making room for new aspirations, giving expression not to lamentations over vanished glories, but to joy and gratitude for deliverance wrought in our own day. Still, such a prayer book was nowhere to be found. So he set to work, and after years of toil and labor, he brought out the Minhag America, which was adopted by most Reformed congregations and which for many years served as the common ground for their religious solidarity and a sign of their spiritual union.
So this is our Rabbi Adolf Moses in 1903 explaining where Minhag America, the first Reformed prayer book, came from and why. What is he saying was the reason we needed a Reformed prayer book? Because it kind of sums up what oughtn't be in there and what should be. What makes for Reformed prayer? What do you think he means by these new aspirations giving expression not to lamentations of vanished glories?
Talking about maybe moving away from Zionism, maybe, and more
It wasn't Zionism per se, but yeah, moving away from this, like someday we'll go home, because this is America.
America is our hope, and we can prosper here.
So there is an intended, maybe it's a little early to call it anti-Zionist, but this is not going back home, reestablishing the temple and offering sacrifices again, which was so much a part of the traditional prayer book. People praying for something that they didn't really want anymore. So it wasn't just knowing what you said when you pray. One of the challenges to translating the prayer book is then people know what the prayers say. And once they do, they go, really? We're praying for this? And that, that becomes a whole new revolution in prayer. Something that was looking forward, that was more rooted in American culture, that it was talking about our lives rather than the lives generations past, but more the future that we see in this country of our own. This is a quotation from the minute books of our congregation from the year 1848, talking about high holiday services in particular, and a particular prayer that if we get to know other prayers, we're definitely going to do. With Michael, would you like to read that?
All the shaking, bowing, jumping, beating, the shandas, and all other misbehaviors are strictly forbidden.
Okay, so this is during high holidays. No shaking, bowing, or jumping. What does that mean? Anybody know what he's referring to? Or
Some things I saw this morning have returned.
Rabbi, I remember as a child the priestly blessings, and they, the cantor where I was raised and the rabbis would be doing some of this kind of behavior.
Right. There'd be swaying with priestly blessings. There's,
they went prostrate. Yeah, they went prostrate. I mean, it
people
was
turn
amazing.
around so you don't see it.
Right.
There's a lot. There's the davening behavior, which is almost rhythmic and beautiful in a certain sense. It's almost I don't know. It creates that physical movement that that there's explanations for, but it's just sort of culture that comes over time. There's the kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. They're talking about that too.
Is that the jumping?
This is the
Is that what
important
they mean by the jumping?
jumping. That's this.
Oh, okay.
Kadosh, kadosh, kadosh.
Okay, thank you.
I do that in other places. We do it at camp. Anyway.
Rabbi, in the 1950s, my mother was very proud that our congregation was very sedate, and she was extremely embarrassed by all the Yiddishisms. People would wear a yarmulke. She would be horrified. Anybody even talked about a talit, she would cringe. And I think it was sort of a lot of fear and need to assimilate that was driving.
If you were to ask your mother why that bothered her, she'd say it's too Jewish.
Exactly.
It looks too Jewish.
Yeah, they wanted to fit in.
Right. Okay. So all these things were part of the sort of undertone, but it almost becomes a stated thing that Reformed Jewish prayers were supposed to have more decorum, meaning it should look nice. These were Germans, keep in mind. They wanted everything in rows. It should, you know, there were also things about don't leave your tallis laying out, it's sloppy, that kind of thing. It was all about order for them. And this sort of communal movement and, you know, free-form prayer, that was something a little much for them. They wanted everybody to sit there quietly, listen to the professional choir. If you're going to respond to the prayers, it would be in choral response because it was all more structured. That was more a cultural thing. I'm still driving you to the one we haven't talked about. What does beating the shandas mean? Does anyone know what a shanda is? Carol and Dan are like doing the word shanda. Go ahead. Yes. Lisa?
Doesn't shanda mean shame?
Yes.
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 Some word for
friend who just married a woman named Shonda. There was kind of an interesting.
It's a beautiful Yiddish name. We called our daughter Shonda. It probably means Shanda. Shanda means beautiful. Okay, so beating the Shandas is a prayer. It refers to a prayer called the Hashanah, which is a list. We just read it in service. It's a list of the things you might have done wrong. That we all, in a traditional congregation, you all stand up and you all recite these as a group out loud. It's actually, we'll move on, but the beating part is that with it's an acrostic, ABC or Aleph, Bet, Gimel. With every letter, you would tap your heart. Some people tapped harder. And this comes from, this develops like, you know, beating your breast. Have you heard that expression? That comes from here. Or beating yourself up over something. Okay, because you're upset that you did something wrong. This comes from here. That metaphor comes from here too. I don't know that most Americans know when they say those expressions that they're quoting, you know, from Jewish liturgy, but they are. This was called the gates of repentance, and we all kind of call it that in English now. The alphabet of woe is called the Ashamnu from the first word, which starts with the letter Aleph. The first thing that we did wrong, which was Ashamnu. It's a very old prayer. It's found in the original prayer book, the original Machzor, which is Seder Rab Amram, which goes back to the 9th century. That doesn't mean it's 1,100 years old. It means it was already in the prayer book 1,100 years ago. It probably goes back long before that. We don't have the actual Seder Rab Amram, the actual book, but we have copies of that book, and that was the oldest prayer book we know. Some archaeologists may move it back further someday, but that means it was already an established prayer that was in the regular weekday service, which it still is in a traditional congregation. You just don't see it because it's done quietly to yourself and there's no beating. Okay, but on Yom Kippur, everybody stood up just like we say out loud the Baruch Shem Kavod. Everybody stood up together and said the Hashamnu and pounded on themselves. It's an acrostic, which means the first word is an Aleph, starts with Aleph. The second word starts with a Bet. The third word starts with a Gimel. Each one of these words is something you may have done that you shouldn't have during the past year. There are 24 letters in it. I know there's 24 letters in the alphabet, but not in the Hebrew alphabet. In the Hebrew alphabet, there aren't. But the last one, Tav, there's 3 in a row that are done with a Tav starts. And this was my sister's least favorite prayer. She's not here to defend herself, but I'll just talk about her behind her back. She used to sit there listening to this prayer saying, I didn't do that one. Why should I have to say I'm sorry for that one? I didn't do that one. I didn't. Then she'd stop and go, okay, I did that. Okay, so she would only read the ones that she actually did. But you kind of are missing the point. The point is, we've all done something wrong. We've all gotten to this point at the end of the year. Okay, looking back, we should all be able to see that we weren't the best that we could be. And we're all going to stand up together and say, we've all done something wrong. And maybe not even somebody in the room did all of the things that are there, but by making this list, which was an A to Z or an Aleph to Tav list, we've probably done them all. So let's all stand up together and say, We're all of us not perfect, and we're all of us hoping to be better in the year to come. Okay, that's the real point of the Hashanah. This is a copy of the Shamnu in Hebrew, and if you can follow my pointer, see, oh, Benji, my pointer works. Thank you very much. There's the Aleph of Hashamnu, Bagadu, the Bet, the Gimel of Gazalnu, Dibarnu, Dofi. There's a couple of Daleds there. It's a phrase that starts with the Dalet, and you go through the entire alphabet until you get here where you see Tav, Tav, Tav. So here's the question. How would a good Reformed prayer book that wanted us to know what we say when we pray translate this prayer? Let me explain the problem. This is a translation you were probably used to. It came from the Gates of Repentance, and it's in the High Holiday prayer books that we're using right now. It takes the poem, which is a poem that's built on an acrostic, an Aleph to Tav acrostic, and it puts it into an ABC acrostic that has something you might have done wrong for each letter of the alphabet, because that's what the poem is about, right? So that's how we got to say the sins of arrogance and bigotry and cynicism and deceit and egotism and flattery and greed and injustice and jealousy and kept grudges and were lustful and malicious and narrow-minded. Others were obstinate, possessive, quarrelsome, rancorous, and selfish. There was violence, weakness of will, xenophobia. That's how the xenophobia became part of our regular vocabulary. And we yielded to temptation and showed zeal for bad causes. So you understand that that's a perfect translation of the poem because it does exactly what the poem did. You also understand that the poem doesn't use any of those words, right? These are the actual words in the poem. We've trespassed, that's what the word ashamnu means. We've dealt treacherously, that's the word bagadu means. We've robbed, that's what gazalnu means. And so if you were to literally translate the prayer, you would know what the prayer said, but that's not what the person who was writing the prayer meant. They didn't mean that these were the particular things that you've done wrong. We don't know that we did those things wrong. My sister's right in that regard. It's not about that, though. It's about the ABC. So if we run out of time, and we're going to very soon, how would you translate this prayer? Do you go with A, B, C, D, E, F, G? We've done them all from A to Z. Or do you want to know what the prayer meant and read those words? What would be to know what we say when we pray? What would be the right Reformed translation? Any thoughts?
Both.
Both. Oh, Rabbi David's always cutting prayers because it's going to be too long on Zoom. You want to add a new prayer? We'll do it twice. I like that. That's sort of traditional if you think about it. It's like the three Tavs at the end. We'll do them both. This one actually has both of them worked in there. That's why I like this particular version of the prayer. Rather than say the whole prayer twice, they're at least showing the fact that it's an A to Z or A Aleph to Tav form. Okay, we're going to go fast. Sorry, but I want to get through this. Avinu Malkeinu. You've heard of that one. It happens a lot in services. There's actually, it began, for those of you who came to Slichot for the study session, it began with one line by Rabbi Akiva. It's grown to 44. Reformed prayer books use them all, but we scatter them. That's why if you pay attention, we're saying different things in the Avinu Malkeinu each time. It's a collection of our greatest hopes and fears in the coming year. But for many of us, and I'm wondering how many of you, it doesn't even really matter which version of the words we're doing. It's about the song. The song has almost, the song is the prayer. It captures you. It carries you. It's that moment at the ark where we're saying we're sorry, and the rest of it kind of floats away in a lot of ways. And if we didn't get to lead you with anything else, I wanted to just leave you with the song. This is just a minute clip, but this is, everybody's got their favorite Barbra Streisand song. This is mine. Is this coming through? Can you hear it?
חטאנו לפניך, אבינו מלכנו, חנוך לנו, ויבוא לנו,
I hope you got some of that at least. That version that she sings, the version that we sing, that was written by Max Janowski about 100 years ago. That's the traditional one. It's only 100 years old. I mean, there's 44 lines, and those, few got picked because Max thought they rhymed together nicely. We think of, even in music, we think of the songs, the traditional songs, like Shema Yisrael. That's the only way you should sing the Shema, according to my sister, because that's the way we grew up with it. Okay, because that's the traditional way. Max wrote that too, 100 years ago. And the songs that we really know, the old songs like Adon Olam Asher Malach, that's a German drinking song from about 150 years ago. They came with the Reform movement when they came over here from Germany. The melody is, at least. We don't have time to do all the slides I put together, but the lesson is within here. We changed the words, which sounds very radical, but the words have been changed and developing for thousands of years. We changed the melody, which sounds literally very radical. I mean, to be fair, when Max wrote Avinu Malkeinu, he never imagined that Babs was going to be singing it, because women didn't sing in synagogue. Just that is a huge innovation. Things change. Our prayers change. And underneath it all, that first beginning of we know what we say when we pray, that asked us to really be engaged with the prayers, started the revolution that is Reform. Because when you know what you say when you pray, then you think about what you're praying for. And at first, in the early stage of the Reform movement, that meant, well, we need to change the prayers because those aren't things that we want to pray for. But in today's Reform movement, if you know what you say when you pray, it also means you ought to mean what you say when you pray. So when you pray for peace, maybe we should be working for it. And when you pray for health, maybe we should be trying to sustain it. And when you pray for, the land of Israel, then maybe we should be working to make it not only our land, but all our land. Reform Judaism has grown and developed over 200 years and more. And it's changed a lot too. I know the Reform of today probably looks different to some of the older ones. You remember what Reform looked like when you were kids. And I'm sure that Isaac Mayer Wise, it looks very different than the Reform movement of his day. But Wise in his day thought that women should be rabbis. And I'm hoping he's smiling now that they finally are. And he believed in a context that we've actually come our way back to, which is that we ought to be open to accepting and embracing tradition when it makes sense in our lives. We ought to be open to new traditions when we need to build them to make our lives make sense. And that's why it's not just about how the prayer books changed. It's about how we changed. And it's about how Reform Judaism should always be changing to meet our lives and our aspirations to actually have a life that has meaning in this world, in the presence of God, and in, as part of a holy congregation. Anyway, thank you for coming to class. It's great to see you.
And for us old people, let's dust off that organ.
Yeah, that organ part. We should get back to.
I would love to hear it at least once in a while if that could be arranged.
I'll talk to Louis for some of our upcoming classical services. These are my last classical services for the year too. So for Bernheim Shabbat or something like that, we should trap Louis in the choir loft again and see what we can do. That may be cool.
For us old people, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. Wonderful class. Thank you.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Josh, gonna miss this.